Hello, welcome back to IASA's Virtual Leadership Series. This is our second episode on performance, managing and measuring workloads. Once again, I'm Darin Reffit, Director of Product Marketing Excellence with Guidewire Software and the Chair of IASA's e-learning committee. And I'm joined again today by Cathy Ellwood, the founder of Ellwood Enterprises, and Kerry Crockett, the CEO of IASA. So Kerry, Cathy, last week we shared our insights on the impact of COVID-19 specifically on objectives. And this week, we want to look instead on leadership competencies. How do leadership competencies need to change in a virtual world? Now, this is a big topic, so we're going to address a number of things, but let's jump right in. Kerry, I guess the first question I would ask is, aren't all leadership attributes the same regardless of where your team's located?
Well, I would say in some ways yes, and in some ways no. The real fundamentals of being a good leader certainly remain the same, but there are unique aspects to managing remotely that really come into focus. What's different here is the emphasis is really placed on certain competencies that are needed to address the unique challenges of leading virtual teams. So, for example, you have to really step up your game when it comes to communication. I don't think you have the benefit anymore of those in-person meetings where body language and facial expressions are easily read. And if most of your communication is by phone or by email, you really have to go that extra mile to make sure that you're clear and that the meaning of your message is easily understood. I think when possible, take advantage of those video chats and be consistent and prompt and timely in your communication. And one other is developing trust. We've talked about that previously in some of these episodes. It's really critical to the success of remote teams. You have to be open and honest and accessible and really ready to hear some of that hard feedback sometimes. I think another small tip is just acknowledging birthdays and individual successes. That really goes a long way to help build trust and build that team together. And then finally, I think clarity around expectations is another attribute that really should be emphasized in a virtual environment. Are there a clear division of tasks? Does the team know the reporting process? Are they clear on the specifics of the task, et cetera? So I think all of those attributes are really emphasized in a virtual environment more so now than ever before.
I agree totally, Kerry. What I've seen, there's some really unique differences. To your point, yeah, leadership competencies are a lot the same, but when you think about working in a remote environment, you have to think about the different ways of working. How do you get information? How do you use information? What do you do when you have a question? And you have to recognize that digital skills vary. Digital skills vary across the team. Some people are really used to, working with different kinds of files, and they know how to go out and get things. They know how to research. And other people can barely even open a spreadsheet and work with it comfortably. So, even as leaders, a lot of times we depend on our staff to do the things for us, and they're not really here right now. And, they're here virtually, but not necessarily here to fix the printer when it's not working or, figure out how to get reconnected to a certain app that you've never worked with before. Some people are a lot more technically skilled than others. And that can be really frustrating when you're on the other end waiting to get connected into a call. So as a leader, you've got to have a lot more patience. I also think another unique challenge that leaders have is how do you keep a team and individuals motivated? What can you do to make sure that you're really inspiring them to do the very best that they can do? You're going to have to work differently. You're going to have to work harder. I think that another issue that people often have to realize is the concept of equity. So what do I mean by that? Making sure that everybody's treated fairly, making sure that everybody understands the criterion upon which they're being measured. And I think too often what comes into play there is that people aren't aware of how much of the evaluation is subjective, how you get things done. In a virtual world, it's going to shift the focus a little bit. And so certain competencies are going to come out to be much more important. Kerry mentioned communications. That's definitely one of them. And then I think the other thing that we have to think about, when we're thinking about performance management is the overall effects of distance learning. I mean, you've got technical issues that come into play. You've got too many meetings. We've talked about that. you have less social interaction. You can't necessarily go grab a bite to eat with one of your teammates, go to lunch, have that face-to-face time that you normally do. So what happens is it's harder to build trust, right? So it's harder to cross-train in an organization. And so you have to become very independent. Another thing I do think is more pronounced, especially when you don't know the teams and when you haven't worked with them, are the cultural differences. When people don't know each other, they tend to be more judgmental, and it makes them it makes it harder to trust each other. And that creates uncertainty. So if somebody says, oh, I'll get it done by Friday, and they don't know you, until you start delivering and building trust through results, it's a little bit of a problem. And if you're having to listen to and interact with somebody that you don't personally know, sometimes what happens are differences that come from the language barriers or accents. So you have to work harder to listen. And I think that's a real unique difference in this type of environment, especially for leaders, because some people hear in different ways.
That's absolutely just the cultural, when you work at a global company, especially, managing through the cultural differences there's so much nuance to it that you maybe don't pick up on, and having a real focus on, diversity, equity, and inclusion can be so important to managing that. I do want to jump back. You mentioned something about digital skills and how they vary. And I think this situation has really, brought that to light. As someone who was always like the unofficial tech support person in my team that would help people, hey, the printer's not working, hey, do that. I do wonder how people are surviving. And I'll throw out an anecdote. A friend of mine is actually a political, he works in Washington, D.C. for a political agency. And he was on a call with a number of senators and representatives recently. And he was talking about them having Zoom issues and having to bring in their assistants to help with that. And you just don't think about that, right? He was like, it was so incredibly surreal, like sitting there and hearing Nancy Pelosi like call someone in to help her with a Zoom issue, right? But on the other side of that, I read a research report recently that said that workers are losing, I think it said 22 minutes each day dealing with either IT issues or lack of digital skills or access issues. Kerry, do you have any thoughts on how we can manage to that?
Yeah, if you do the math, it comes out to be over, 90 days a year. It's just a lot of time that we're wasting there. And it really can be challenging. We know that it's really just not enough to be able to operate those devices and the applications and all of those things that go along with the work that we do today. And you have to think too, we have a broad range of generations that are in the workforce now. And so you've got those young folks who grew up with this already and they know all the tech stuff, all the way up to those who are probably closer to the end of their career perhaps and may not be as tech savvy. So it's a wide range we have to think about. But I think employees really need to find and share that information and communicate and collaborate and really constantly learn and adapt so that we're able to achieve those tasks and solve those problems and be more productive and successful in all of those things. I mean, it is a real challenge. I think if you have people that are comfortable navigating that virtual world, they tend to be more productive, obviously. I mean, you have to realize that leaders themselves often lack those skills, and we've talked about that already, about some of those in sort of the end of their career, as I mentioned. They may not have some of the same skills, and they're often the ones that are leading those teams. And so, if we lack those skills as leaders, we still have to do all these, and it still could impact our performance, and then it could impact our team's performance as well, because we're not able to do the correct amount of work, the way that we need to work as efficiently as we need to do. So it really does require working differently in this day and age.
So another thing that I was thinking about, Kerry, and you're so right on this. I think that in a virtual world, leaders really need to understand the importance of assessing their staff, their employees' technical skills, and what resources do they need to do their jobs well so that they can thrive. A leader provides the resources. It's no longer just about saying, well, you need to get this done by a certain day. you need to make sure that they're adequately trained, and you know they've got digital literacy. People need to know where the information is needed to do their jobs, and they need to know how to get it. There's not necessarily that, hey, Kerry, sitting right next to you, where do you get this? It's not that easy anymore. Do they have people, resources that they can ask for help? And I think another factor that comes into play here is being engaged. Leaders need to rethink how they communicate. We've talked a little bit about that, but how do you know your teams are really engaged? I know that there are some technologies out there that can help you monitor that, but that's not what I'm talking about. Are your employees actively listening? Are they participating? Are they contributing value-added comments to the meetings? And then the other thing that I think also a leader's got to think about is career development. How does that leader foster the career development of their people? So in a physical office setting, a lot of physical networking can occur. You can recommend that they go to lunch. You can recommend that they go meet with this individual. In a virtual world, that's a lot different. So how does a leader get your high and top performers the exposure? And even the people that are, starting to become top performers, how do you get exposure? So leaders got to rethink, how do they foster the career development of their staff? What's the development planning process going to look like? I mean, we talk a little bit about digital literacy. Well, that's got to be a priority, even though maybe prior to working in a remote environment, that wasn't necessarily the top, factor. But if you can't communicate and work through and navigate through technology, all of your skills are for nothing, because people aren't going to be able necessarily to leverage your expertise. We talk a lot about delegating and a lot about being specific on expectations. Most leaders that I know have a really hard time delegating. They want to keep the real hard work or the most critical work to themselves. And they have to learn that that's no longer going to be possible in this environment. Otherwise, if they want to keep it to themselves, they're going to be working around the clock. So when we talk about defining specific goals and accountabilities, that's great. But we also have to define, what are our boundaries? What are the things that we can do without having to ask permission? And what are the absolute no? You've got to get approval. You've got to communicate well. You've got to, talk to me before you deal with this person. And what are the standards now that we're going to be setting for measuring performance?
That is just a lot of different topics. And I do want to point out to our audience, we're not going to get to all of them today. We are going to cover networking in a future episode, networking virtually. We are going to talk about actually measuring performance in our next episode. But I do want to connect two dots, because it's interesting. You talked a little while ago about equity and how important equity is, and then digital skills and measuring performance. And it's just interesting, we've been talking a lot about, from a diversity standpoint, the difference between equality and equity, right? And if you think about a person who's really at a digital disadvantage to someone younger and more of a digital native, equity would be taking that into account, right? And as we're starting to develop and measure the goals, making sure that that's part of figuring out exactly how someone gets measured. So I'm so excited to talk more about that next week. But let's jump back and talk about where do we start tackling this issue, Kerry, that all these issues that we've talked about so far.
Well, I think, like everything else, it really starts with that clear vision for what you're trying to accomplish, and being able to really clearly articulate those goals and expectations to your team so that they fully understand what's expected, how they're supposed to move forward, how they're supposed to move forward as a team. I think that's really important. And I think, leaders really need to have that agile mindset and set the example for the others to follow. We know that what's worked in the past is not going to work for today. And I think if you're not willing to learn some new technologies, some new ways to work, and to work differently completely and help your team along the same way, how can you really expect others to do that and to follow your lead? I mean, it's just going to be impossible.
I totally agree. I do think that leaders need to look at their own behavior. They need to realize that too often they confuse delegation with abdication. And in a virtual world, that's not going to cut it because people can't get the job done if they don't know what they need to do and what their boundaries are. The other thing, and this is something that's going to be hard for people to maybe want to believe, but maybe we're hiring the wrong people to work in a remote environment. There are just going to be some people that aren't going to be comfortable here. They're not going to fit in. And if you can't work well in a digital environment, that means being able to work both independently and collaboratively, you're probably not going to make it. If you're not able to assimilate information from multiple sources and gather it from multiple sources on your own, you're probably going to be in trouble.
Okay, well, so what are some of the critical success factors that you should be looking at as you're thinking through these things?
So I guess for me personally, first, I think you've got to ensure that you as a leader have set up mechanisms to validate your staff's understanding of your communications. It's not a one-way street anymore. You need to make sure, and it really never has been, but it's more complicated here. You've got to factor in different communication preferences. Some people like text, some people like one-on-ones. How do you do it? How do you do those kind of things? You've got to align your employees' development priorities with the technical proficiencies that they need to do their job in this new world.
Yeah, and I think along with that, you really need to be thinking about who you are hiring. Just as Cathy mentioned earlier, hiring for really training people to be agile and adaptive. I think it's going to be more important than ever to look for those folks who are organized communicators, because they're really going to have to go above and beyond in how they are reaching out to the rest of their teammates and communicating with the team. And I think too, we have to manage that to that virtual situation, which is completely different for a lot of us. Thinking about, as we talked about in last week's episode, more frequent mini reviews and making sure that you're giving and providing continuous and ongoing feedback, and then iterative goal setting as well.
Well, one thing I actually do think is it's going to probably require some recalibration of your performance management system. So in other words, what might have been a critical objective, in the old world is no longer critical in the new world. The results are, but you also have to look at how you're getting things done. And to be successful as a leader, I think you've got to also, and this is even for your managers too, you've got to integrate factors like teamwork, cooperation, engagement, being actively participating on the Zoom calls and in the meetings. And then finally, ethics, because, people have got to trust you, and they've got to value what you value in terms of the work outcomes. So, it helps to eliminate the confusion, the uncertainty, and it helps you to build together as a team.
Okay, well, so we've got a couple things we're going to come back to. We're going to come back to networking in about 2 episodes. Next week, I'm really excited because we're going to bring this all back together and talk about actually measuring performance, right? So before we close this episode out, let's go to final thoughts. Kerry, let's start with you.
Sure. I think the one thing that resonates with me about this conversation is that it's a great opportunity for leaders and managers to step back and really think about how they're managing their teams in terms of how they're communicating. Are they building trust, those kinds of things, and really taking a hard look at folks that work for them as well. Do they have the same types of characteristics, attributes that are really needed in this different environment? And how can you coach and train them to help develop some of those attributes that will serve them well and serve their teams well also. So it's just really giving yourself that opportunity to step back and think about how you manage, what your managing style is, and sort of assess the things that you think have worked in the past. Are they continuing to work in this environment? And if not, how can you adapt and change them so that you do find a way forward that will work well for your team and for you as well?
Yeah, it's definitely a great time to abandon the "this is how we've always done it" mentality. Mm-hmm. Cathy, final thoughts from your side?
So yes, the leadership competencies aren't going to change, but how we look at them and how we use them will. The one thing that we haven't talked about, we've talked a lot about digital literacy, but we haven't talked about the business enough. And so I think one of the things that people have to realize is the more you understand the business, the drivers of profitability, who your customers are, and the strategic direction of where your company is going, the better off you're going to be in being able to apply this new skill, these new skills, this new world of working remotely to helping you accomplish your tasks and goals and objectives much more efficiently and a lot more effectively. And you're going to be positioning yourself for change, and that will make you value added to your organization.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for joining us again this week, and we will see all of you again next week as we jump into measuring performance. Thanks and have a great week.